Welcome to the Joy Lab podcast, where we help you uncover and foster your most joyful self. Your hosts, Dr. Henry Emmons and Dr. Amy Prasek, bring you the ideal mix of soulful and scientifically sound tools to spark your joy, even when it feels dark. When you're ready to experiment with more joy, combine this podcast with the full Joy Lab program over at joylab.coach.
Hello, I'm Henry Emmons.
And I'm Amy Prasek. So welcome to Joy Lab, where we infuse science with soul to help you uncover joy. To do that, we focus on our elements of joy, the positive inner states and emotions that become the building blocks for a joyful life. In this episode, we're turning to our fifth lesson of Loving Well, which is about the power of belonging. Certainly, this lesson holds on its own, but it might be helpful to scoot back to the other lessons if you haven't listened to those. You can do that after this one. I think this lesson perhaps may be the easiest to sell, though. We all want to belong, and we always have, even the introverts and self-proclaimed lone wolves. We want a pack of other introverts and lone wolves to call on, even if just to complain about extroverts or social butterflies. We're just tribal creatures. We want to affiliate. We want to be part of something larger than ourselves. It is woven into our biology.
Oh, I agree. And I'll share a really cool example of that. So I think we all know that we lose brain cells as we age, right?
Been done. Always hear that, yes.
Some of us faster than others. But so neurons die off just in the course of normal living. There are some things we can do, by the way, to slow that down with really good lifestyles, things like diet, exercise, sleep, reducing stress, but it's still going to happen. It's just in the nature of things to decline with time. But that's not the end of the story. We also have stem cells in our brains, and they are able to create brand new brain cells to replace some of those neurons that we're losing. And that is called neurogenesis. It is a super important thing for keeping our brains working well, our memories good, and cognition good as we age. So every one of us wants to be really, really good at neurogenesis. It's that important. And I think it's useful to remind us that this process does not end when we turn 25 and the brain is supposedly all done developing. Neurogenesis goes on throughout our lifetimes. Here's the thing that I find so interesting about it. When a new brain cell is born from a stem cell, in order to survive, it has to reach out and connect with other neurons. They have to sync up, so to speak. And it takes a lot of these connections in order to survive. If there aren't enough of them, the new cell just shrivels up and dies.
That's such a great metaphor for us human beings. I'm thinking of Harlow's research on love and attachment, his sort of famous, and I'd say extremely unethical studies with rhesus monkeys. I'd also say unethical because we didn't need controlled studies to understand how terrible outcomes are when we are isolated or even worse, abused. Nonetheless, I'll note a bit of one of his key studies, and then I want to maybe say something about the irony of the end of his life. There's the hook, cliffhanger for this episode. Stay with us. So maybe some of you already know this study, but Harlow essentially took baby monkeys away from their mothers just a few hours after birth and then made them choose between two mothers he had made. One was made of soft blankets, but gave the monkeys no food. And the other was made of wire, cold hard wire, but had milk for them. And Harlow found that those babies spent way more time with the blanketed, foodless mama compared to the wire one. So Harlow's conclusion was that we really need affection. We need comforting touch and support to cultivate relationships. And Harlow also found that when the cloth mom was present in an unfamiliar place, the baby monkeys would explore. And if the cloth mom was removed, the babies would freeze, crouch, or they'd cry or scream. They just couldn't move. This suggested that support, presence, and loving connection was essential for behavioral and biological development, for exploration and for growth. Here's the irony, though, about Harlow and his research. The rumors in the research world were that Harlow was a nightmare to work with and nobody could stand him. And when his wife died in 1971, he became even more vicious. Here's a comment that Harlow made to an interviewer in 1974. "The only thing I care about is whether the monkeys will turn out a property I can publish. I don't have any love for them, never have. I really don't like animals. I despise cats. I hate dogs. How could you like a monkey?" Sounds like a great guy, right? Red flag. Sorry. So anyway, he also, after his wife died, really began isolating himself. He started to drink heavily. He cut off from his kids. And then he died in 1981. And when I learned more about Harlow, I just couldn't shake that the last decade of his life reads like the last paragraph from one of his pit of despair studies, as he called them. He put himself in isolation, and without any help out, since he'd cut off from everyone, he continued to spiral down or shrivel up and die, as we talked about with the neurons. Sorry, it's not funny, but it's very interesting to just think about how that power of connection to keep us not just surviving, but to thrive. And we are like those baby monkeys. It doesn't matter how old you are. Throughout our lives, we absolutely need those connections.
Yeah, I used to run a program called resilience training in order to work and help people with long-standing problems with depression, help them recover from that. And we did a lot of work on lifestyle in that program, things like diet and exercise. But the heart of the program was really an 8-week course where we essentially taught people good, really useful, accessible skills, mental and emotional skills that were all based on mindfulness practice. So in doing that program for years with literally hundreds of participants, we'd often see people who actually turned the corner on depression, even people who had problems that had gone on for years and hadn't responded to other treatments. So there were two things that really stood out with those folks. One of them was self-acceptance, really, really learning to accept yourself as you are. And we talked about that in a recent podcast. I think it was podcast number 21. And we're going to go into it actually in a different way next month when we shift our focus to compassion, because there's so much great research on self-compassion. So self-acceptance or self-compassion, that was one of the key factors. But the other one was to create a stronger sense of connection. Because the problem with depression and even anxiety for so many people is this illusion of separation. That's kind of my term for it. But it's this belief that we are separate, isolated beings. So the counter to that, the solution, so to speak, is to build a house of belonging.
Yeah. Start building. I love that idea. So the phrase comes from a poem by David Whyte called The House of Belonging. Here are a few lines from the end of that poem. I've taken a few liberties to cut some pieces out. So please head to the show notes where we'll link to the full poem. But here's a bit. "This is the bright home in which I live. This is where I ask my friends to come. This is where I want to love all the things it has taken me so long to learn to love. There is no house like the house of belonging."
I think that's just beautiful.
Yeah.
And it reminds me so much of when our family built a timber frame cabin a few years ago. So timber framing, for those of you who don't know it, it's like what you see with an old-fashioned barn raising, kind of like how the Amish do it. So you put the posts and the beams together first on the ground, and then you raise up the entire wall, and you have to hold it in place somehow until you get the connecting beams put in place. So it's that kind of thing where you're creating the structure with these posts and beams. But before raising the walls, you have to cut the timbers to fit together without using any hardware, no nails or screws or anything. So like I said, it's old fashioned. It's really, really cool and really fun. Yeah. So if you're building a whole barn, or even if you're building kind of a modest sized cabin, this is a ton of work. It's way more work than I could do by myself, or than my wife and I could do with our two sons. So we invited our friends, and some of them invited their friends. And by the end of this 2 weeks, we had 2 weeks at the North House Folk School in Grand Marais with 2 instructors. And by the end of that 2 weeks, we had people literally coming in off the street asking if they could help, because we were clearly having so much fun.
I love that.
Yeah. So, it was just people who really wanted to share this kind of experience. Sure, to do something with your hands, because we don't often get to do that in this world anymore, but also to have this fun experience of community. And it was incredible. For me, it was just a 2-week high. So in thinking about this episode, we thought it'd be really great to work more deeply with this image of building a house. So the goal is to end up with a really rich, genuinely supportive community of connection. This is the opposite, remember, of this belief in separation where you think that you're on the outside looking in. It's realizing that you are part of it. You are inside the circle. You're living inside the house that you're building.
Right. And we each have our own idea of what kind of house we'd like to live in, too. What size house? Not all of us need a great big house. So how many people do you really need to have a sense of belonging? I like that question. And the research on this is pretty interesting, particularly considering how much pressure we might feel to have like a big social media following, or to have a party where a bunch of people show up. Research shows that to support your overall well-being, you really need about 3 to 5 people who you feel like you could call in a crisis. People who you feel comfortable sharing hard things with. People who you feel really loved by, close to. Only 3 to 5, right? If that does seem like a lot to you, or maybe you have a lot of friends, but few really close friends. So here's some encouragement to focus some energy as we provide some tools here on building up just a few of these types of close, loving relationships. We all need them, and we can all create them, but it does take work. I like evolutionary psychologist Dr. Robin Dunbar and his Dunbar's number, as he calls it, which describes a maximum amounts of meaningful and stable relationships we can have at one time. Just like cognitively, we have a maximum load. And I love his work on friendships and these proposed limits or boundaries, because I'm someone who is both an introvert and who also has a serious issue with FOMO. So this is helpful for me. So here are the maximums that Dr. Dunbar notes we can have. 5 really close bonds, like best friends. 15 close friends, people you spend time with, feel quite comfortable around. And this number usually encompasses those 5 folks before as well, because Dunbar sort of categorizes these relationships in concentric circles. So they all kind of like interact and then build on each other or expand out from each other. Outside of those close friends is a maximum circle of like 50 friends, people who you would invite to a big party or who you might build a cabin with. And then beyond that 50 are a circle of 150 sort of casual friends, people who you might invite to more of those once in a lifetime events, like a funeral. I guess you wouldn't see them there then if it was yours, or a wedding. Funny enough, I'm remembering that my husband and I, at our wedding, we had 400 people. And as Dr. Dunbar noted, and is spot on, I could absolutely not name 250 of those folks that were there. 150 max.
Well, it sounds like a fun wedding.
It was good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't realize you had FOMO, Amy.
I do.
I've got it too. I have a pretty bad case of it, and I'm not even an introvert, really. So we'll have to talk about that later.
Oh, yeah.
So back to the house building metaphor. Before doing the cabin barn raising, we had to prepare all these timbers individually. And even before that, we had to choose the lumber that would become the timbers. And before choosing the lumber, we had to create a design and make a blueprint of the cabin. And then even before that, you need a vision. What do we want in this building? And there's even a step before that, I guess, which is you've got to have the desire to build it in the first place. Now, let's start by assuming that each of us already has the desire to build a house of belonging. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. But the next step is to have an idea and to get it so clear, this vision, that it can be turned into a written blueprint. And let me tell you, timber framing is really intricate and detailed. So the vision has to be very, very clear and specific. Now, in all the different workshops I've led, like resilience training, the inner life of healers, and now Joy Lab, we spend a lot of time working on this vision, creating it first in our minds of what we want in our house of belonging. So you start with your mind, with your images and ideas of what you want. And whether or not we actually write it down like we would with a blueprint, I have really been surprised at how powerful it is to have that very clear picture in my mind of what it is that I want to create. If you do, it's remarkable how it just flows from that vision. It still takes effort, don't get me wrong, but it's almost as if it's already created. And the only thing that would stop it is to not do the work to bring it into manifestation.
I love this thoughtfulness. If you were actually building a house, you'd first look around at a lot of other houses. You'd Zillow. You'd drive through all the neighborhoods. You'd have all your Pinterest boards. You'd talk to other people who have built the kind of house you want. You create a good idea of what you wanted, and then you change it as you go. As you grow, you'd redesign it in ways that fit you better. I like how Dr. Dunbar, back to Dunbar's number, he notes that we move folks around through those circles of relationships that I noted. These are not just static concrete. When somebody lands in a circle, they have to stay there. I think sometimes we can get into that feeling, but instead this thoughtfulness, right? This idea that there's movement and flow here. Dunbar also notes this is especially true in our teens and 20s. There's a lot of movement within these circles, but it does continue through life. It gets a little bit more stagnant in our 30s when folks start having kids, because having kids is like a wrecking ball for your social life. Which I'm like, yeah, I hear you, Dunbar. My numbers are a little stagnant. But I also love the image of picking out the timbers. What kind of people do we want in our house of belonging? Who are we drawn to? Who will help make it strong? Who will make it more nourishing?
Yeah, well, interestingly, there are just a handful of timbers that are really key, where you've really got to choose carefully, because they're going to provide so much of the structural support for the entire house. And it does remind me of that number 3 to 5 key people that you talked about, who we know will always have our backs.
Yeah, I love that idea of those folks as like our structural support. That's exactly that feeling that those relationships can offer. They're there. They're just there, but in this simple and powerful way, they're present. But those relationships take work, as you said before, Henry. Time is finite, and we have to choose which relationships to build. I like Dr. Jeff Hall's research on the number of hours it takes to move someone from a stranger to a best friend. These hours need to sort of be held in a shorter period of time, not over the course of a decade. But maybe you can guess here, Henry. How many hours do you think does it take to move a stranger? Listeners can guess too. Into your best friend's circle.
Whoa, I have no idea. I really don't have any idea if it could be 100, it could be 1,000 for all I know. But the thing that really seems important here is that there is no substitute for time.
Yes.
You just can't magically, have this happen. Anything of value like this takes time. So what's the answer, Amy?
200.
Really?
Hours.
Well,
Yeah.
I was in the right ballpark.
You were 102,000. Yeah. I mean, but there is no substitute for time, as you said. And these relationships need tending, and 200 hours in a bit of a shorter period of time, because you kind of need those consecutive or numerous moments of just sort of being together to establish that comfort and to go deeper, as we talked about in our episode about listening deeply. But yeah, I think our message here, and the message from research, is that we can all build our house of belonging. And what's more, we already belong in this larger world. We've arisen out of it. But here's this profound opportunity to build a loving, healing place that feels even closer in, I suppose, right? Even more supportive, but it does take work. At least 200 hours per person. Thankfully, that work is generally nourishing in every direction, both for the other person and yourself. That work, the time you put in, feels really good. So I think to kind of wrap us up here, I want to close on a similar message from David White. And this is from his book, Consolations. He writes to us, "But no matter the medicinal virtues of being a true friend or sustaining a long, close relationship with another, the ultimate touchstone of friendship is not improvement, neither of the other nor of the self. The ultimate touchstone is witness, the privilege of having been seen by someone, and the equal privilege of being granted the sight of the essence of another, to have walked with them and to have believed in them, and sometimes just to have accompanied them for however brief a span on a journey impossible to accomplish alone."
Thank you for listening to the Joy Lab podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, visit joylab.coach to subscribe for your monthly infusion of joy and to learn more about the full Joy Lab program. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.